Hello guys and welcome back to another video. So today we're going to be looking at the Choosing Your Own Tank series once again, and the class in the spotlight this time is the Nightblade. Now before we get into that, a brief aside. So some of you have been curious as to where I've been and why the channel has lacked content these past few weeks. Now the short answer is that I've been very busy with university work, and on top of that I've been doing some work on the weekend, meaning that ultimately I've had very little time to play games and record videos. Now, I did have a week off, and that is why we're getting some videos now, but these are pre-recorded, and that does mean by the time you're listening to this video at least, I will have been, well and truly back to study by then. Now, in terms of looking forward to the future, you can expect me to have a lot of content out when Morrowind finally hits live, and that's because my holidays are then as well. Even though I am writing my dissertation during my holidays, I will have definitely got a lot more time to play, which will be fun for me and hopefully enjoyable for you in terms of the content on the channel. So look forward to that. Anyways, let's get back to the focus of this video, which is breaking down the Nightblade class and considering why it will be good for you as a tank. And because the PTS Morrowind patch notes have recently arrived, and I do recommend checking out my review of those if you haven't already on my channel, I'm going to also tailor the discussion looking not only at how Nightblade tanking is currently, but also how it will be in the future to better inform you in choosing your class for your tank. So, with that said, let's get into the first class tree, which is the Assassination line. Now, the Assassination line in general has a lot of DPS orientated abilities, the ultimate as well, and also its passives seem to be more DPS focused. However, there are a few gems within this tree which is worth mentioning. Now, one of the utility options is Teleport Strike, and this is a gap closer. Now, gap closers aren't often used within tanking, but there are some fights where they can be quite useful, especially in places such as Cradle of Shadows, where you need them in order to close the distance and interrupt a mechanic, otherwise your group could die. Now, the nice thing about Teleport Strike is that you can have a Magicka gap closer, because otherwise a lot of tanks sometimes use the weapon skill line, which is stamina based, and so it's nice to have the alternative as it promotes more build diversity. If you want to be a Magicka tank, for example, it's probably better to be using Magicka for these things rather than using that very low stamina pool. You can also morph this, it's worth keeping in mind, to a stamina ability as well, so flexibility there. The next ability, and this is in a similar vein to the flexibility point I just said, is Blur. So for other tanks, in order to get major evasion, they have to go with the evasion ability in the medium armor skill line, which is a stamina based one. It's nice then to be able to have a Magicka based ability, which promotes, giving you the option between Magicka based Nightblade tanking and stamina based Nightblade tanking. A benefit of Blur is that it's 26 seconds long, making it one of the longest major buffs in the game, and just helps you with managing your bars a bit more effectively. Obviously, if you pop this in your back bar, you can kind of forget about it for a bit longer than you would otherwise with shorter major buffs. So it's probably also better for a beginner. In terms of the morphs, I wouldn't recommend Double Take because I find that the major expedition buff is wasted on a Nightblade, as you'll see at least for Nightblade tanking, because we have other ways of getting major expedition. Now, Mirage is the buff of choice here because it gives minor resolve and minor ward. Now, you already get these resistance buffs if a healer is running combat prayer, which is the meta and is run by almost all healers, but I find this useful especially if we're moving out of combat prayer to have this self-contained, and well, if you're in a newer group where the healer perhaps doesn't have this, it's always good to have a little bit of extra tankiness. So, the better buff to go with and the one I'd recommend. Another ability which on the first look doesn't seem that useful for a tank because, well, if we're running sword and board, we've got pierce armor, right? That gives us major fracture, major breach, so the fact that Mark Target provides it as well doesn't seem too impactful. However, if we're running an Ice Staff build, and you'll see my build, it's a hybrid, it's running an Ice Staff back bar, sword and board front bar, and if you want to look at that build in particular, there's a video on my channel, you can check that out, and I think that build will actually be quite good moving into Morrowind, so maybe it would be worth your time getting to grips with it. Anyways, I digress, moving back to Mark Target. So if you are running an Ice Staff build, there's no way for you to get major fracture and major breach simultaneously. This being a 17-second duration debuff is actually quite nice as well, so is a useful way for Nightblade tanks to debuff the boss effectively if they're a full Ice Staff build, and you should keep this in mind if you're thinking about Ice Staff tanking. Moving on to the passives, Master Assassin is a damage orientated passive, so nothing really to worry about there. Executioner, though, is one that can be quite useful, especially in AoE environments. As you'll see when we get into a little bit later of the discussion, Nightblade tanks tend to do a lot of AoE, and especially if you're a Magicka-based tank, getting a last hit on an enemy, or killing an enemy, sorry, and getting Magicka back can actually be quite useful for sustaining, and will especially be true with Morrowind because Morrowind is nerfing sustain quite a bit. Now, Hemorrhage is another one to keep in mind because of the group utility component. If you deal critical damage, you grant your allies minor savagery and also yourself. However, because tanks have quite low critical, this means that you're not going to be proccing it too often, and another Nightblade is probably going to be proccing it, to be honest. On top of that, if you notice, we don't have that many assassination abilities even used, especially on my build. If I do use Blur, obviously we'll have one, but keep in mind that Hemorrhage isn't going to see that much proccing, especially because you need an assassination ability slotted to begin with to actually proc it. I did gloss over pressure points, but once again this is related to using assassination abilities, and even though a little bit of critical and weapon and spell critical is good, because when your heals crit they'll be doing more healing, the overall effect is going to be pretty marginal. Let's now move on and break down the shadow tree line for Nightblades. Now this tree is probably one of the strongest for Nightblade tanking, and it all begins with the ultimate ability Veil of Blades. Now not only is Veil of Blades a very long ultimate, making it very cost effective because it only costs 170 ultimate, at least with my build, it provides a very powerful effect, reducing any damage you and your allies take when you're inside it by 30%. In addition, you also slow the enemy's movement speed by 70%, helping with ad control, and it deals a little bit of extra damage, meaning that if you do lose taunt on one enemy, they might actually stick to you because you've already dealt damage to them. There is also a synergy component to this, which can be useful if your allies take a lot of damage, want to press the synergy very quickly to go invisible and heal, and also get some movement speed to get out of danger. In practice, at least in high-end groups, this synergy can overwrite some other synergies which are more useful. So it can actually be detrimental, because obviously in higher end content, we care more about necrotic orbs, shards, and some other synergies more than we do about this synergy in particular. In terms of comparisons to other tanks, it's probably most comparable to Nova's. However, I think Nova, while being a lot shorter in duration, can be a little bit more useful in that to get the 30% damage reduction, the enemy only has to be inside it rather than all your allies, so it can be a bit more flexible if your allies don't want to necessarily stack on top of you, or at least on top of the Veil of Blades. The next ability to look at, Refreshing Path, is one of the best abilities that Nightblades have access to. This ability can first operate as an initial aggro tool. If you cast this ahead of you and it hits enemies, because it does damage to them, they're more likely to hit you, which is always good because you can take the hits and your allies can't, and this gives you some time to then get a proper taunt onto the enemy, forcing them to attack you. On top of that, this ability operates as a heal, healing not only yourself, but your group, so it's a nice mix of self-sustain and group support. Now you may have remembered that I said with Blur, don't get the Major Expedition morph, and that is because this ability very efficiently provides us with Major Expedition. Now the value of this does depend on the fight, whether we have to be mobile as a tank, but it's always nice to have irrespective, and who knows, maybe the fights with Morrowind will promote more tank mobility than the current fights we do have, so it could always be a future benefit as well. There's also a hidden benefit by using Refreshing Path, and this is applicable to all active abilities in the Shadow line in general, and that's because they interact with one of the passives in this tree. And that passive is Shadow Barrier. Now Shadow Barrier is the way that Nightblades get their major resolve and major ward buffs, and every other class in the game currently actually gets this for a specific ability. This means that Nightblade tanks don't have to dedicate a bar slot to having an ability which just grants them this buff, rather they get it bundled in with an excellent ability like Refreshing Path. Now the duration of the buff without any heavy armor is only 4 seconds, but since our Nightblade tank often uses 5 pieces heavy, this means it's given a 125% bonus. While currently the passive does not line up perfectly with Refreshing Path, they are going to be buffing the base duration of the Shadow Barrier passive to 6 seconds with Morrowind, which will make Nightblade tanking rotations a lot better and also make Nightblades feel tankier. With that said, let's now look at the next ability, Aspect of Terror. From an initial outlook, this could have been actually quite a strong ad control mechanic because it fears enemies, stopping them doing damage, and also snares them. And if we morph it, we can actually have it apply minor maim to them as well. The other morph offers us even more flexibility, allowing us to cast this ahead of time, and it will then plant a rune on the ground which will activate if an enemy goes near it. This could have been quite good for anticipating ad spawns and casting them in locations where we know they spawn, so that allies don't fall prey to them if we can't get taunt fast enough, but ultimately the way that fear works goes against the tanking mentality. This is because when you fear an enemy, they're going to be running away from you, which interrupts the stack and burn mentality that is so prevalent in tanking nowadays. When I say that, I mean that it's your tank's job to stack enemies together so that your DPS can use their AoE, area of effect, ground damage abilities to kill enemies fast, and that is very important for a lot of content because obviously you don't want to spend all your time within the dungeon. Perhaps with Morrowind we will see a use for this, but as it stands right now it's not really used within tanking whatsoever. Summon Shade, however, used to be a staple of Nightblade tanking and is still run in a fair few builds. This is an excellent way of getting minor maim, debuffing the boss's damage if you do not have Heroic Slash on a sword and board bar, and this is most relatable if you're running an Ice Staff bar. Now, Ice Staffs do provide minor maim for the chilled status effect, but it's not 100% guaranteed, and so this is a way of doing so if you want to ensure the boss is not hitting you quite hard. In addition to that, some boss mechanics obviously ignore taunt targeting squishier allies, so it can be quite important to have minor maim applied so that they do not die. One thing to quickly mention though is that the Morpholus ability, which allows you to teleport to your shade, can be quite fun. Time now to talk about the passives that we have not yet discussed. So Refreshing Shadows is a nice passive from a sustain standpoint, and will especially be helpful when Morrowind comes with all those sustain nerfs. Getting a stamina and magic recovery buff is always nice, especially if we're going to have to use a mixture of magic and stamina more kind of evenly than we have in the past, as obviously Morrowind is also nerfing maxing one particular stat out. It doesn't want you to have, say, 40k magicka and barely any stamina. It seems to want to promote a more balanced level of resources, at least for your tank. Now, health recovery isn't that big a deal, but it will help you take a little bit more hits, minor effect, at least when compared to stamina and magic recovery. Dark Vigor is the next one to consider, and when we have a shadow ability slotted on our bar, it's going to give us some extra health. And max health is always nice because it enables us to take bigger hits and live, and also gives healers a bit more time to react and heal us so we do not die. Finally, Dark Veil increases the duration of your shadow abilities by 15%, and this just gives you more bang for your buck for your ability, as obviously this is not tied into how much the ability costs. This means that things like Refreshing Path are going to last longer, and Veil of Blades is going to last longer, just making the abilities much more effective. Let's now finish our discussion by talking about the Siphoning Tree. Now, the Siphoning Tree is the source of a lot of our sustain as a Nightblade tank. The first ability of importance is Swallow Soul. Now, Swallow Soul is good because it does provide a little bit of extra damage, meaning we can help burn the boss a bit faster, but it also provides us with a nice heal over time effect, which is obviously going to help with keeping us alive when we're tanking a lot of enemies or just tanking a high damage boss. Now, on top of that, when you're slotting this, it's going to give us minor vitality, increasing our healing received by 8%, and because Nightblades can be a bit squishier than, say, a DK tank, this means that not only are our heals buffed by 8% when it's healing us, but also the healer's heals that we're receiving will be buffed by 8%, which is always nice for ensuring we don't die. Now, there are some diminishing returns with this if we have other healing received buffs, but for our purposes, don't worry about it. Siphoning attacks is the next ability to consider, and this really is the bread and butter of SAP tanking, as it's come to be called, Nightblade tanking. Now, the reason this is because it allows us to keep our resources up really by ourselves without any external stimulus quite easily, especially if we're using our light attacks and weaving them in with other abilities, or even using block to animation cancel them. And if you want to know how to do that exactly, please do check out the tutorials on my channel, and there'll be a relevant link to that in the video description down below. Now, another factor to consider though with siphoning attacks is that unfortunately they're going to be changing this come Morrowind. Now, they've changed the base unmorphed version to only restore HP, and this is more directed towards newer players, so when you're questing, you have less chance of dying as you constantly have that healing every time you light or heavy attack. Now, when it comes to the morphs, you now need to pick between stamina or magicka, and your choice here is probably going to be dependent on whether you're going to be using stamina to block, so a sword and shield tank, or magicka to block an ice staff tank. Now, these changes are actually quite significant, and it's honestly going to change the playstyle of a Nightblade tank. It's going to move away from that amazing sustain and the ability to spam abilities, so frequently, and really it's going to create a Nightblade tank in Morrowind which I think is going to be substantially different to the one we're familiar with now. So please do keep that in mind. You're not going to get the same experience in Morrowind as we currently have. In addition to that, as far as I can tell, they're nerfing the siphoning attacks a little bit more. They're removing the 10% direct damage component where you have a chance, 10% chance per direct damage ability to get back resources, which just further adds to that nerf. However, as I said before, it's not all bad, as they did increase the Shadow Barrier passive, making Nightblade rotations a little bit less resource intensive, which is nice. Moving on from siphoning attacks, let's now look at Sap Essence. Now, Sap Essence, one of the initial benefits, at least, is that it acts as a major brutality and major sorcery buff. Now, for our tanks, obviously we're not interested in doing a lot of damage, but this certainly will increase it a little bit, which has an interaction with Soul of Soul. The more damage you do with Soul of Soul, since it's a percentage based in terms of how much healing we get back, means more damage, better healing for ourselves. In addition to that, increasing our weapon and spell damage is also going to increase how much healing our heals do, so that also means more heals for ourselves and our group. Now, probably the more fun part of this is using it in an AoE environment, though with the nerfs to siphoning attacks, if it is the case that direct damage abilities no longer will restore or give you a 10% chance to restore stats, this does mean that we won't be able to spam this quite as much with Morrowind. However, when we are in a trash pack and using this, not only does it do good AoE damage, but it also heals our allies quite well, meaning that if there are untaunted enemies hitting them, they're less likely to die. With that said, let's get into the passive abilities. So Catalyst is the first, and getting 20 ultimate when we drink a potion is a really nice buff to our ultimate regen, making Nightblade tanks have the strongest ultimate regen in the game, probably tied with sorcerers because sorcs get that passive which reduces ultimate cost. Magicka Flood is a nice little extra 8% bonus to our max Magicka, especially good on our Magicka tanks, as obviously the 8% is going to go a bit further the more Magicka we have. But the caveat is that we need a siphoning ability slotted. Fortunately though, as you see for my build for example, we have a siphoning ability here, not only on our back bar, but on our front bar. Soul Siphoner is the next one to consider, and this increases our healing done by 3% when we have a siphoning ability slotted, just a bit of extra group support and also self-sustain, always welcome. Finally, Transfer is going to be generating 2 ultimate every time we activate a siphoning ability with a cooldown of 4 seconds. And this actually is quite nice and lines up with Swallow Soul, and we're going to be casting Swallow Soul consequently a lot faster than the 10-second duration. We'll be casting this pretty much every 4 seconds to be getting as much ultimate as we can, so that we can support our group with Veil of Blades and also with the excellent ultimate which almost every tank runs, Aggressive Warhorn, which gives them extra stats and also gives them major force, increasing their critical damage. Anyways guys, that about rounds it up for this choosing your tank Nightblade video, and I hope you enjoyed it and it informed you in your choice as to what class you might go with. Perhaps Nightblade is the one for you. So please, any feedback would be much appreciated. Let me know if it did help out, and well, until next time, I'll see you all later. Bye bye.